Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a pretty mind-bending journey today. We're looking at four incredibly advanced, globally connected ancient civilizations whose greatest achievements were just lost, wiped away by time. It's like looking at a giant puzzle where half the pieces are missing, all because of how they kept their records, or how those records were completely destroyed. Because here is the absolute golden rule for everything we're about to cover. History isn't just what happened, it is what survived. Our entire grasp of the past hangs on these incredibly fragile threads, things like physical artifacts, scraps of writing, or spoken stories that somehow, against all odds, weathered the storm of time. When those records disappear, the history basically vanishes right along with them.
Okay, let's dive into this with our first mystery, Great Zimbabwe's erased history.
So, Great Zimbabwe. It was this massive, thriving civilization located in modern-day Zimbabwe. Now, you might not hear it brought up in the same breath as ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, but you absolutely should. Flourishing from the 11th to the 16th century, this place was booming with up to 20,000 people, and their architecture, unbelievable. They built the largest stone structures in pre-colonial southern Africa. We're talking precision-cut bricks forming walls that towered 36 feet high, and they did it completely without mortar, just perfectly stacked stone. Plus, they were totally plugged into a massive global trade network. Archaeologists have literally dug up glass beads from India and Ming Dynasty porcelain from China right there in the ruins. Oh, and they entered the Iron Age, smelting and forging tools centuries before Europe even figured it out. Just a deeply complex, incredibly advanced sub-Saharan society.
So why is there this massive blind spot in our history? Well, Great Zimbabwe didn't use a written script. They relied entirely on oral traditions. They passed down their knowledge, their triumphs, and their history through stories, poetry, and songs. But when European colonists eventually stumbled onto these abandoned ruins, they let their own intense biases completely blind them. They literally refused to believe an advanced African civilization could have built this, so they tried to credit the Phoenicians or the Arabs instead. And here's the real tragic irony. The colonizers actively rejected the oral traditions of the local Shona people, just brushing them off as urban legends. By the time scholars finally woke up and accepted the reality of Great Zimbabwe's African origins, centuries of invaluable oral history had already been lost for good.
All right, moving on to number 2, the undeciphered Indus Valley. Let's flip the script a bit. We're going from a civilization whose spoken records were ignored to one where the written records actually survived, but they basically function as an uncrackable code. I'm talking about the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization, and the contrast here will blow your mind. This was a 7,000-year-old society stretching across 900 miles in modern northwest India and Pakistan. Up to 5 million people lived there, and their urban planning was just so far ahead of its time. Cities were laid out in perfect grid patterns using these highly standardized baked bricks. They had indoor plumbing, like actual clean running water and sewage systems in every single home. They even built wind catchers into their houses to act as early indoor cooling systems. Yet despite all this overwhelming physical evidence of a highly organized society, we know absolutely zero about who ruled them, what their laws were, or what gods they prayed to.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the crux of the whole mystery comes down to a single number, 5. See, the Indus Valley people did have a written language, the Indus script. We found it stamped on seals, tablets, and pottery. But the average number of symbols in a row on these artifacts is just 5. They are simply too short. Without longer strings of text, linguists literally cannot run the statistical analysis needed to decode the grammar or the syntax. We don't even know what spoken language it correlates to. So it's this perfectly isolated linguistic puzzle that keeps their entire history locked in a vault. And we are talking about a massive chunk of time here. We can trace their physical footprint from the early farming settlements of the pre-Harappan era all the way back in 5500 BC, peaking during their mature urban phase and finally fading out in a slow, mysterious decline ending around 1500 BC. That is thousands of years, millions of lives lived. We can walk through the physical remnants of their streets, but we can't truly understand them because their words remain completely silent to us. Which brings us to number 3, the sudden and total Bronze Age collapse. So let's pivot over to the Eastern Mediterranean. This is a fascinating and honestly kind of scary cautionary tale about early globalization, intricate supply chains, and how incredibly fast a thriving world can just unravel. Right up to 1200 BC, you had these massive, highly advanced superpowers, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mesopotamian city-states, and they were deeply intertwined through trade. But here's the catch. They all relied on what is known as a palace economy.
Think of it as a highly centralized system. The royal palace controlled everything. They handled all the production, collected all the resources, and redistributed the wealth. It was a remarkably sophisticated setup for sure, but ultimately it was terrifyingly fragile. Because these societies were so entirely dependent on that single centralized supply chain, any major disruption was just catastrophic. Historians believe they essentially got hit with a perfect storm of systemic failures. Imagine a prolonged drought hitting the region. Suddenly, that triggers massive crop failure. Without crops, the centralized palace has absolutely no food to distribute, which kicks off widespread famine. Starving populations quickly lead to violent civil unrest and internal wars, which completely shatters the society from the inside out, inviting foreign invasions and ending in total societal collapse. It was a rapid-fire domino effect that wiped out some of the most prosperous societies on Earth in just a few short decades. And out of all that physical destruction came a devastating historical destruction. The Bronze Age collapse triggered a massive crash in literacy. Entire writing systems were just totally abandoned. So while the buildings were literally burning and people were just fighting to survive, centuries of administrative records, cultural history, and literature were actively destroyed. A short 50-year span from 1200 BC to 1150 BC created this massive dark gap in our historical knowledge that we are simply never going to be able to fill.
Finally, for our last mystery, number 4, the Polynesian Pacific Voyagers. We are going to end on a note of just absolute awe at human ingenuity. Long before European expansion from roughly 1300 BC to 1250 AD, these incredible seafarers navigated and populated almost every remote island across this massive triangle of the Pacific Ocean. And get this, they did it in canoe-like boats, no maps, no compasses, no written navigation logs at all. They relied purely on observing the stars, reading the ocean swells, and tracking bird flight patterns. And since there was barely enough room for food on these boats, let alone a library of written records, navigation became a fiercely guarded oral tradition. Expert guilds actually encoded these life-saving wayfinding secrets entirely into song. Just imagine asking, hey, what's the song to get to the next island? If your settlement ran out of resources, your survival literally depended on knowing the right song to sail to safety. It is an incredibly beautiful way to store knowledge, but again, as we've seen, oral traditions are so vulnerable to being lost, which sets up this genuinely delightful, unsolved genetic puzzle. Modern evidence proves that sweet potatoes, which definitively originate in South America, were being cultivated all across Polynesia way before any European contact ever happened. That means that somehow, some way, these Polynesian voyagers made contact with South America, acquired the sweet potato, and sailed all the way back across the open ocean. But because their incredible achievements were recorded only in songs and spoken traditions that faded over the centuries, the exact story of how they pulled off that monumental voyage remains a complete mystery today. So when we look back at Crete Zimbabwe's ignored spoken history, the Indus Valley's uncrackable script, the burned records of the Bronze Age, and the lost songs of the Polynesian voyagers, it all points to one really provocative thought. If our complex, hyper-connected world collapsed tomorrow, what fragments of our history would actually survive? Would future explorers be able to read our digital hard drives? Would they understand our massive global supply chains? Or would we too just become another mysterious gap in the history books? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the past.